Hey everybody, welcome to Module 5. Here we'll be looking at data management, calling it managing the data. But in reality, I think a big chunk of this focus, we will be talking about data management in itself, but I think this particular module and lecture will be heavily focused on data analysis itself. So this particular slide, obviously the objective slide, but I just want to, point out a couple of things. There's lots of ways to do data analysis, but we'll stick to basically the data analysis kind of described in your readings. I think we'll just talk about basically what data analysis is. What are some of the steps of a couple of data analyses strategies, and most importantly, we're going to look at, or we're going to talk about data management, right? And what I mean by data management is like storage, safekeeping. Data management is kind of sometimes used as like a larger concept of everything that happens when the data is collected, right? So that's basically, from storage to how you develop your data analysis team to even how you report findings. So keep that in mind as we're talking about, but towards the end of this particular lecture, we will talk about data management, but more of a very specific type of data management, not the whole overall process of post data collection stuff. So as we're starting talking about data analysis, I want to focus on three areas just for introduction into this topic. We're going to be talking about, the type of approach, a question type, and the purpose of data analysis. I think, the first part of it is, the approach is just remember that qualitative methodology, right? Really, you've heard it both inductive, deductive, but that's really what we mean by like kind of approach. So always remember that a good chunk of qualitative research, does use that inductive approach, and I think we'll be, as I discuss some of these terms, keep that in mind. That's kind of like the approach that I'll be, or the standpoint that I'll be speaking from. Do remember that. Remember, when it comes to qualitative research, the questions tend to be exploratory, open-ended, and the data is usually in narrative form, right? I mean, you're collecting interviews. There is some data analysis when it comes to observations, but I think for the most part here, I think the key elements are some of the strategies used to analyze actual the interview data. So just remember, as you're looking at types of analysis, or how you do, what kind of entails analysis, right? The purpose of it. Do remember that, we're just trying to get meaning, using thick descriptions. We're trying to get a sort of measurement of values, characteristics of things. Remember also, it's good to, or it's a nice reminder also, remember, lots of qualitative work is not really done for generalization, so keep that in mind. I think we've talked about already why we don't really, our goal really is not to generalize our data. That's just because we want to figure out what's going on in a very specific context, right? Or just a parameter of unit of analysis. However, in order to examine that, we do need that very systematic, very appropriate way, very clear ways of doing things, because the next person that comes along, they should be able to, in a way, figure out or find, conclude similar findings to what you did. So just remember, that's kind of, keep in mind as you're thinking about, data analysis, data management, data collection, just all those processes. Just remember the purpose of qualitative, and I hate saying methodology, but qualitative methods or qualitative approaches. So just remember that the reason that we basically do all this stuff and we try to make it very systematic is just because a lot of I mean, as with everything, we have to make it real. I hate to use the word reliable, but but the thing is, we have to make sure that are the people that we're trying to reach, right? We're trying to basically tell the story of our participants, of our units of analysis. Remember, we want it to be convincing. We want it to be, believable. We want it to make that point that this is contributing to what is it called? To the, to telling the story of these people. So just remember that, when we're trying to, I guess, lack of better terms, we're really trying to increase validity, and at the same time, simultaneously, we're trying to really filter out and make sure that bias doesn't enter our um, strategies or the way that we conduct the qualitative research. So I think one of the biggest components about data analysis, right? So the thing is, and just as a refresher, so remember at this point, when we look at data analysis, remember we have already collected the data, we've already done what we needed to do with the data, right? And this is where we begin the data management process. We edit, we transcribe, we edit our transcriptions. We really kind of start putting together our observations, our field notes. We start laying it out in front of us. What is it that we're going to analyze? So the first big process, though, especially when it comes to interview data, right? We start coding, right? Coding can mean a lot of different things, and as some of your texts, the texts that say, there's lots of types of coding and strategies and just procedures. Here's the tricky thing about coding, though. I think one thing you'll see, I think it's becoming a little more systematic, right? That's kind of why I put it in quotations, because the thing is, though, is that many people, the beauty about, remember I told you, qualitative strategies, qualitative approaches really kind of allow for flexibility. However, though, sometimes that flexibility can't really be replicated, right? Because just because something works for you, right, doesn't necessarily going to mean work for someone else or another analyst, right? If we have time, I'll tell you a little bit about how I kind of dealt with this, because I'm actually doing the same thing as well. So, in some of my work, right, when I'm trying to really reach what we call triangulation, where in the way that I'm using triangulation is I'm getting at least a minimum of 3 analysis teams, right? Me being one of them, a couple of PhD students that were working with me are doing another set of analysis, and then I actually hired a whole new data analysis team, at a university out in El Paso. So the thing is, though, is that they were a little apprehensive to really dig into the data, because they wanted a little bit more direction. But like I said, the way that I interpret, data analysis, you can't really, especially when it comes to the analysis piece, everyone has a different way of doing things. Now, what I did is I did provide kind of like a source for how to analyze data. There's a couple of there's quite a bit of text that try to address that inconsistency, right? I can provide you with that text. I can, and then whatever, copyright allows me, I can definitely give you, several components of that, that text. But either way, I can definitely, I believe it's on the suggested reading list in the syllabus. So check it out. It's the Saldana book. And as you can see, like, I think, I believe the Michael Quinn Patton book, if I'm not mistaken, I believe the newer editions, right? If I'm not sure if it's the one that I assigned for the course. I try not to do the newest edition, right? Because it's just like super expensive, especially if the old text really hasn't changed. But anyway, I think the Saldana is actually in the Michael Quinn Patton books and stuff. So anyway, so that particular author has a pretty good text, and when you read it, it says that that's the goal of this textbook, right? Is to gain some consistency when it comes to the data analysis piece, especially when it comes to coding, categorization, things like that. So, but either way, before I digress too much, just think about it. And again, these are just some of the more common descriptives that are used for coding strategies, right? So remember, going back, and like I was saying about, remember when it comes to data analysis, you've already should have edited your transcripts, kind of de-identified, did what you need to do, laid out everything in front of you that you're going to analyze, and then try to decide on how you're going to code it, right? So that's kind of like the systematic way, and systematic has many different meanings. So even in your text, you'll see that there's there actually is an actual coding process that they call systematic. But at the same time, as you've heard me in so far in the lecture, this way of doing things, right? The consistency, that's also systematic. So just be careful. There is an actual attempt to classify a very specific type of coding strategy, systematic. But there's also open coding, which I see quite a bit. I think affinity mapping is really, really useful. We'll talk a little bit about that. There's in vivo coding, axial, and selective coding. So just real quick, I think I talked a little bit about systematic already. Now, when it comes to open coding, I usually kind of reserve that particular process to maybe like the first steps of any types of analysis. This is where I kind of just go in, I start looking at the data, and then I just kind of start looking for patterns for, what are some of the, and also, and I should also say it's important to also kind of remember in the back of your mind that you're trying to answer your research question, because you can get lost in that data, especially if you're starting to, in this particular stage, right, where you're identifying concepts, or you're trying to come up with categories, right? So make sure all that kind of aligns to, because the thing is, though, is that there's a lot of rich data in these interviews, right? But the thing is, though, you always have to have in mind, okay, remember, only stick to what's relevant to answering your research question. You can always make another project, or you can always publish another manuscript that kind of lets you have that freedom to, or that kind of gives you that freedom to talk about something that you found interesting from the data. But again, I think when it comes to open coding, that's kind of like, the first step, where you're just kind of looking at everything. I'm trying to, like I said, figuring out patterns. It's a discovery process. But most importantly, remember, this is supposed to come without any predetermined categories, right? This is just something that comes straight out of your data, right? Out of your interviews. So the thing is, I think that's a really, really nice starting point, because, it's kind of like it gives you a good idea of what that very specific, or what that interview in front of you is saying, and how it's going to help you answer your research questions. The next one is affinity mapping. I think everyone's kind of seen this. I think if anyone's been in a workshop at any point, I really see that. It's basically the way that I was taught about affinity mapping. I think they even call it diagramming, but either way, it's basically you literally get like post-it notes, or little stick-it notes, or whatever, and you kind of put them on a wall, or something, or and you just kind of look at all your, depending on where you are in the analysis, if it's just concepts, categories, or themes itself, you kind of just, depending on how you use that affinity mapping, but you basically kind of start grouping the ideas that you write on the post-it notes, and kind of bringing it together. So you literally just like map it. I think when moving on to in vivo coding, in vivo coding is also kind of, it's, I think in the text too, they kind of, in one way, they kind of describe it as it kind of overlaps, right? Like it's kind of a process or sub-process of in vivo coding. But I kind of think that it's maybe its own thing, because I think instead of trying to find those patterns and things like that, it's a little bit more specific. And I use like that in vivo coding for using the actual like words, right? Like there's very key terms, right? In like my work, there's really specific terminology that's used, right? Like I said, I work with substance use disorders as well. So one of those particular things is like I need to, if I know one sub research question that I had one time was what are some of the triggers for relapse of IV or IV injected substances, IV drug use. So the specific language patterns, right? And I hate to use that, but the specific language wording that I was using for are like things like words were cravings. I had withdrawal, things like that. But I think it comes really that that's what in vivo means, right? It's coming directly from the actual person or unit of analysis, descriptive of the concept that you're trying to look at. Moving on is, I think axial coding is also, I think you got to be careful because yes, sometimes this can be like very systematic where it's like steps. But there are certain, people out there that say, well, I did axial coding. But either way, so axial coding, a lot of people say that it's like kind of like after the first round of coding. Again, this is where you kind of go back and you start looking at and start identifying relationships between those categories that you've extracted, right, during the open coding phase. However, though, it just also depends too, because especially if you do like a secondary data analysis, some of those codes may have already been supplied for you, or maybe your data is limited, or the data that you had access to was limited, so on and so forth. So maybe axial coding, right, instead of being so like post open coding, it really is like you go directly into axial coding. But again, it's where you start making the connections of some of the initial the initial codes. I think this is a nice part where it's a little bit before the actual, like where you describe and kind of polish up the theme that you found from your data. Uh, but it also can kind of start telling you or guiding you into that there might be a sub process involved too. So one example comes from like when I was doing some transgender HIV screening disparity work. And the thing that I found was that my intent was just to figure out what is it that got the my transgender participants into HIV screening scenarios. It turned out that aside from that, there was a whole bunch of other stuff that was mentioned in almost every interview, and the things were like suicide ideation, uh, turning to sex work because they had lost their jobs, so on and so forth. So that was like, those were as I was coding, especially in the axial coding phase. I'm like, oh, hey, wait, this keeps coming up too, so I need to come back and look at it. And I think the last part, selective coding, I think for all you out there that are really interested in grounded theory processes or methods, I think this is kind of what you're gonna, when you start reading a little bit of the grounded theory text, you're going to start seeing, that, yes, it kind of starts off with open coding. You're going to go to in vivo coding because you're working. Remember, you're building a theory from the ground up, right? I mean, literally. So I think you use a lot of in vivo coding. You kind of also bring in a little bit of axial coding, and then you kind of start bringing together, but you become a little bit more selective because this is going to feed into your selective, you're going to be selective because this is going to feed into your theoretical framing. And again, in my work, this paper has tried to been published for years now, but it's actually I'm trying to present a theoretical, or I'm framing a trans experience in regards to HIV risk and HIV screening context, basically trying to bring a theory about, what I call the trans experience, right? Where certain aspects in, it takes a deeper dive into social determinants of health, and I'm trying to, bring out that there can be quite it quite be not exactly predictable, but there's definitely a pattern. So, where a trans individual really can kind of go from low, from low vulnerability to HIV to really high, vulnerability at, for HIV. So, those are just examples of the applications. But anyway, like I said, coding is kind of one of those processes that it's kind of hard to really figure out because, like I said, it's just because qualitative work, one of its central goals is to, things are to make things flexible, to be flexible to for the researcher, because it's like literally like an uncontrolled environment, right? You're doing, like, especially a lot of, like, when you do like social work, or social science work. What I do is, like, again, I hate to say that, but it's because it's such a cliche, but, like, street research, I don't know what's going to happen. Like, I can't control certain variables and things like that. So I think, there's different ways of doing coding. So, so I don't really want to get into too much details about open coding. I think I covered most of it in the previous slide. But either way, here's some key points about open coding. Always remember that your data comes from open-ended questions. Always remember that this particular type of open coding, it's kind of preliminary or maybe an initial step, but always keep in mind, because even though you're kind of going in, as if you want to call it a step one kind of thing, remember that to keep in mind that research question, because you really, like I said, you really don't quite have that. What is it called? You don't have that system yet, right? Developed. You're really starting to look at your data. And again, this is where, again, I call it coding, because when people mean coding, I think they're really talking about open coding. I think in some of the supplemental articles, and in a lot of articles that you kind of read, when it talks about coding, they're really just talking about open coding. Um, and then also, it's really important, because remember I told you that we have to have consistency, and we have to convince, our audience that we had a very, quote unquote, systematic way of doing things. So that's why it's important that you document your coding processes, because in a lot of manuscripts, right, and they will ask you, like, well, how did you code? We need a little bit of a description of that coding process. And also, just what I call theoretical recording, right? And that's just kind of like those little side notes, right, where yeah, it's kind of reserved for, like, oh yeah, this is what this theory also kind of spoke about, right? So for example, like stigma, right? I work with a lot of stigma, at least when it comes to, like, HIV, right? HIV stigma is really, kind of a big topic, but there's a lot of theories out there. So, like, I'll even say, like, well, this is specific to HIV stigma, or maybe this is kind of like, more classic kind of understanding of stigma, like Irving Goffman and all that kind of stuff, which I recommend you all read. But anyway, so that's what I mean by theoretical recording, kind of like something like, oh yeah, this is kind of well known, but this is how it plays out in this particular context, that kind of stuff. Because the thing is, though, is that may be very useful. Definitely when you write up your manuscripts or your findings, you're going to need to describe that coding process, but at the same time, it also keeps a record of your thinking processes and stuff. So just like the previous slide, I don't think I'm going to go into too much detail on systematic coding. Just remember that, in some ways it can be kind of like post-open coding, but if, in some of the texts that I've read, actually they just really say, oh, we did systematic coding, right? Hence, again, remember the quotations around the systematic. But anyway, if from your text, it kind of talks about as systematic coding as your kind of bringing in kind of stuff that's already known, right? So maybe it's some work, and this is excluding the work where you're supposed to be completely unbiased, right? So there are some qualitative strategies out there that do allow for theoretical testing, right? Is the theory the most well-known theories, are they applicable in your particular context? There are some strategies for that. So I think when it comes to using that, there is like this particular type of systematic coding where you use these pre-existing categories, for and this is why I put in there, so it can be in sources from that can given you have been could have been existing evidence that's out there, out in the literature, or in the science. And also it could be a process of maybe especially for those of you that work with data that's already been collected, and you're doing a secondary data analysis. Well, sometimes you're kind of limited to using kind of the code categories that were already used before, but you're just using it in a different way, right? So this is kind of like, even in a way, I kind of did a secondary analysis, because remember, I looked at HIV risk context, but then remember I told you that there were other subcategories that came up, and so I used already data, and I called it secondary because even though I was the PI, or the primary investigator, primary data collector, the thing is though is that I did a reevaluation, right? I did a whole new thing specifically looking for suicide ideation and in trans populations. So I mean, secondary, and that just goes to show how it just depends how you use stuff, how you use data. But anyway, so I think these are kind of like the more salient points from at least your readings when it talks about systematic coding. I hope this slide kind of turns out. This this PowerPoint recording thing is kind of went a little wacky. So if there's maybe some bloops or blurbs or something, I try to edit them out. But either way, so the thing is, so this is kind of just a little bit of a slide of what affinity mapping looks like. As you can see here, I mean, this is nothing special. I think I just pulled it off, like a Google search, or diagram search or picture search or whatever, to kind of give you all a good example of what affinity mapping, or in some of your text it says affinity diagramming. But anyway, this is kind of like the affinity process. You look at, you literally put like post-it notes and stuff like that on like a big surface, and you kind of start categorizing. And so, but then that's why I'm saying, like, I think in almost like every recent workshop or conference, there's always a process of some sort, and they do use it it's like a research process, because that's how they collect data. But anyway, that's not really the merits, is more data analysis. So but anyway, don't be surprised if there are some data collection strategies that use this kind of a format too. But anyway, this is more specific. This is like a teams level exercise. This is like when you bring in all the data analysis teams together, and you kind of like, okay, this is my contribution, and then you just kind of literally start figuring out, okay, well, what's the central, or where were the main themes that came out of the stuff that we looked at, and it's kind of the way that I kind of do it. Or if I really first, when I do use affinity mapping, I kind of look at everyone's um, contribution, right, or analysis, what their analysis findings. And then my first step is to just kind of like, okay, we all kind of came up with this particular theme. So that was pretty consistent across, X number of analysis teams. I would just say three, right? Across three analysis teams, this was pretty consistent. So I think, yeah, I think this is kind of like the beauty of it. It's kind of like a team process, and I think that's really key when it comes to data analysis, especially if you're using different teams of analysts, because this kind of brings it, it's kind of like that, bringing it all back together, and that group think process of trying to make sure that your data analysis did have multiple perspectives, is informed by different sources of information, right, that come from your team. But anyway, so this is basically what affinity mapping should look like. And so I'm using this slide to just kind of give an overview of what are some of the things that should be mentioned when you're kind of done with the data analysis part, right? One, keep in mind that make sure that everything is relevant to answering your research question. There's different processes, and we'll talk about it as we go a little further along. But this is kind of where this particular the last step where you kind of, okay, this is what data analysis had. This is also really can kind of feed into like, all right, can we, can we answer a research question? And if not, why not? So you can either do a couple of things, just say like that was it. It's just, nothing, this is what we found. But also, if you're doing this, and this is kind of weird. This is where it gets complicated. That's why I don't want to talk about it right at this point of the term. But the thing is, though, is that you're supposed to be analyzing simultaneously in a lot of these qualitative approaches or strategies and methods. So the thing is, though, is that because the thing is that if your interviews aren't producing the data that you need to go back and you need to make sure that that instrument, right, that interview guide is actually asking the right question or asking it the right way. And this is where you kind of can start telling, okay, what kind of quality of data. But anyway, that's kind of like also jumping back into this slide. That's what data analysis, reporting data analysis is all about. It kind of like, all right, did this process up to this point really help me figure out my research question? But anyway, so as you're in your reports, remember just kind of like the agreed upon themes, central themes. I think one thing that's really important, is that you need to start planning on, okay, as I'm delivering my findings, right, you got to connect it to the actual quotations where these things came out of, right? Because you got to remember, the qualitative research is, it comes from, the person themselves, the unit of analysis, and in order to be consistent or to make your findings that much richer or stronger and more believable, you got to go back and use the quotes where you actually got that from. I think it's also helpful, and this is where I was saying this is why you got to take notes about and kind of remember and describe the processes of data analysis, because here, it's good to always have like, all right, how many codes do we come up with? How many of those turned into categories? How many of those turned into themes? So on and so forth. Because if you've seen a lot of qualitative research manuscripts, right? In the dissemination piece, they do kind of give a little bit of chart of, we came up with these categories and then turned into this and this and this, right? And again, all this goes into consistency and making our use of qualitative methods like stronger and believable, right? And this is where next week we're gonna talk about rigor is, and this is kind of like where the concept of rigor really kind of starts, right? How strong is that data? How strong was the methods, right? Was there some, I mean, you can even ask yourself, what was the level of fidelity to the common most accepted approaches of executing these particular qualitative methods, right? I think it's worthwhile to just spend a little bit of time talking about the software that you're going to use in qualitative data analysis. I think if you look at some old editions of this really book by Miles and Huber, I didn't put I can't off the top of my head, I can't remember. I think I removed it off the recommended list, but I mean it used to be kind of like a thick book, and this is what every PhD student kind of had to go out and get, because it showed you how to analyze data different ways. I have a couple of copies in my office, so if any of you need it, I can always mail them to you. If you're outside of the UTMB area, or I can scan whatever copyright restrictions let me. But either way, and the reason I'm bringing that up is because it's not really done like that anymore. Actually, the software now is so heavily used that we just really kind of we use text, right, to help us like figure out how we're the plan for analyzing data, but for the most part, everything's done on software. Long gone are the days of actually, using paper and you get categories and stuff like that. Maybe in like I said, the affinity mapping maybe, but either way, even you can even put that in, in some of this software. But either way, it's most important to see is, you can use Microsoft Word, Microsoft Excel for a lot of this stuff. So realize, there's a lot of bells and whistles in it. Granted, it's not as specific to qualitative data analysis, but it'll get the job done. Help you. You can just take it straight out of, and or even put in the comment box on the transcripts that you're looking at, right, on Microsoft Word. You can use Excel to kind of give you a tab, give you an overview and of how many times a theme came up or the themes that you looked at. So you can utilize those, those kind of very accessible software. Now, in this particular one, though, I'll segue into it. This is the one I use now. It's a little pricey, um, and um, but either way, there's different ways to access this particular software. This is NVivo. This is what NVivo looks like. I wish I could use my own, NVivo stuff, but unfortunately I can't because um, I'm just afraid IRB stuff. But either way, this is taken off the NVivo website. This is basically what it looks like. It's pretty user friendly. You basically, as you can see in one of the boxes there, you start looking at, that's actually a text, like the narrative from the interview, and then that's being pulled aside, right, and being pulled out of the actual interview. And then, as you can see, there's different colors right below it, like the blue, that's kind of like the initial categorization. Excuse me, the initial coding. The next color over is kind of like, it's like a little side note. It could be like, hey, this might be a category, somewhere down the line, and then, you can, build things out of and stuff like that. But each and every single level or different types of coding, there is a particular option for that though. And it's pretty nice. I think, like I said, this kind of has everything now. And the reason is, I use NVivo just because of the bells and whistles. Really, that's how it was. I find it very user friendly. So that's how, that's really kind of full disclosure. That's why I like NVivo. It was kind of like a dummy like me can really use this stuff and figure it out kind of quick. But anyway, make a long story short, in vivo is just like becoming really popular, and just recently, past couple of I don't want to say, I don't think it's even been 2 years, but either way, fairly recently, they really expanded. Now, you in vivo now is like transcribing, and it actually has different bells and whistles where it helps you find actual categories and things like that. But again, remember, it's looking for the patterns. I don't think, there's an AI component to that, transcribing the actual, like, first level kind of coding that it can do. And it even has a cloud storage. So that's why I kind of use NVivo, and I'm kind of like a big NVivo kind of person. Just because, it's, well, one, it's really kind of like the only thing I know how to use. But either way, I've been happy with it. If, as you move along in your proposal processes and dissertations and things like that, if you are doing qualitative stuff, come talk to me, and especially if you'd really like to use NVivo for it. I know there's other programs too. I'll talk a little bit in the next slide about Atlas TI, but I think a couple of my students, like some of them use like Otter and things like that. There's different levels. Some of them are just like transcription kind of stuff. Some kind of help you analyze data. I think another popular one is Deduce. That's kind of like a cloud-based data management system. But either way, there's lots of them. This is NVivo. This is what NVivo looks like. They got Mac versions and PC versions. I got both. I think another reason I like NVivo's too is because the stuff about Mac though. That's kind of changing. I think just because the Mac, a lot of people have really used Mac now for all processes of qualitative research stuff. But either way, one thing that unfortunately with a lot of the software though is that it's still to this day it's kind of only limited to like PCs, and if there's a Mac version, it's kind of clunky and it'll crash and so on and so forth. But in vivo really hasn't given me any problems, so hence why I'm also a big proponent of it. And this goes without saying, I don't think it's that popular anymore. But this is where, as a PhD student, when a couple years back, this is what I learned, and I think to learn stuff, and I think it's I used Atlas TI. Again, this is also from Atlas TI workshop that I sat in a couple of years back. Um, but either way, it's kind of like this is kind of like the one that's really commonly used out there. So I think especially if you have like international researchers, chances are they have Atlas TI, and just in general, like Atlas TI is kind of accessible to. Um, uh, I mean, almost everybody has it, I think. Um, but granted, I'm like ivory tower, so the thing is, so it's like, so my circle is very small anyway, so that doesn't say much. But either way, I think for the most part, mostly everyone has access to Atlas TI. I think it's a great learning tool. It's pretty straightforward. It actually kind of helps you get practice of like types of coding that you're doing, things like that. But either way, that's really, again, I use in vivo now. I'm probably even falling out of what is it called? Understanding how to use Atlas TI, especially if they've improved on it and added, because it's been quite a few years since I've even used it. But either way, I know I still have it somewhere in an old laptop, I'm sure. But either way, this is kind of like the more, I think the price is definitely a little more manageable, especially, sometimes that, if I have to go out and buy licenses for like my, collaborators in the community and stuff, um, this is probably more than likely what I would buy, because it's pretty easy to kind of use. It's user friendly. I think that's a big selling point. But either way, I don't know if this is still um, as popular as it once was. But either way, here it is. It's Atlas TI. And like I said, I still see, and in a lot of manuscripts, I still see a lot of qualitative researchers using Atlas TI. So this is what it kind of looks like. And I think what's easy, what I really like about it too, is that it doesn't have its own, I don't know the terminology, right? I'm no computer scientist, but like, I guess its interface kind of looks like something that, like, from Office. So I think that also is helpful. Like drop down menus, selections, things like that. So, and it's very specific. It lets you focus on actual narratives or parts of interviews and things like that. And that's what you'll see. That's what you see on this slide here. But either way, and not only that, you can actually, especially if you're gonna use Excel or Word, um, this really, almost, I think I remember, I'm not sure if I'm remembering correctly, but I know a couple years back, I think there was an option to tie Atlas TI to Excel and Word. So, but I'm not sure if that's still the case or what. But either way, so I think this is the probably a little bit even more well, not user, Office products, like Excel and Word, friendly to like integrate the integration of the software. It really fits nicely with that. But either way, like I said, I don't really use it anymore. I use in vivo, but it's still out there, and it's still pretty popular. So lastly, remember, like I said at the beginning of this lecture, is that data management is kind of like a whole process, right, in itself, of post post data collection, right? But either way, there are some specific, like like the other another level of data management is actually what you're going to do with the data, right? Because you have to remember, these are very personal stories, and it's just ethically you are responsible for the data. You got to make sure that confidentiality is maintained, that the data is protected. You just can't leave it just out in the open waiting for some hacker to come take it or something. But either way, but so there is a way of data management, and the reason that I actually started putting, well, one, because it's a topic of the course, but most importantly is because this is becoming like a new thing in grant writing, right? They want a pretty clear data management plan, slash even like even down to the level of data sharing. That's included in data management as well. So that's just an FYI when you all, if you haven't written grants already, definitely when you hit your first faculty positions, you're going to be really paying attention to this particular processes, right, of data management. But anyway, so just think about, the selection of what you're of what you looked at, right? What kind of data, what data did you use? What are the processes that are going to ensure like not only what you did, but what you did to safeguard, right? So I think you know when we look at when you look at data management in itself, right? You start thinking about. Remember, this is again talking a little bit about like what the overall post data collection process, right? The selection, what you did, what you used, the collection of data in itself, right? What is it? And how are you going to safeguard that, right? Like, I use field notes, so how do I keep that safe and away, because that's all that is needs to be protected, because someone takes a look at your field notes, and it can be de-identifying, right? And it can cause problems with confidentiality. So also another thing is analysis, right? You got to be, well, one, what analysis type are you doing? What are you doing with analysis? But most importantly is that you got to also make sure that this data is being used in the right way, because sometimes, especially if you're using more than one analyst, things that can come across are like, a lot of people don't work in the office or in areas where they say they're going to. They'll take it home, and they'll leave a transcript out, like, in the subway or in their car, and it gets stolen, or they left it at Starbucks, something. But I think not most importantly, but I think some of the key components aside from that, this is where we start looking at storage, right? You got to be clear on how you're going to protect that data, right? Everything is kind of cloud-based nowadays, and electronics. So you got to make sure that your storage is encrypted, your interviews, your data is encrypted. But also not forgetting that there's a physical component to data storage, right? Like, you got to lock it up. That's why, like, RB says, how are you going to take care of this data? And there's some boilerplate points that you put in there. Like what's going to be locked in a locked office in at UTMB. But like for me, where I have to do like off-site research, I actually had to buy literally a safe to be put into my collaborators, the clinic site that I'm working at. Like they had to come in and install a safe for that data, because that was really the only way that IRB felt comfortable enough to approve my projects. So, but also, but most importantly too, is that I think, just to finish, when it comes to data management, is who owns it, right? And this is just really kind of up to you. So think about this as you're writing this, in thinking about it, because so in a way I'm kind of different. I come from a different tradition and I was trained by sociologists who are very community-based orientated. So it was the assumption was that the researcher doesn't own the data. It's the ownership of the collaborator, right? So I think this is why, like, you'll see in some of the manuscripts that are coming out pretty soon from this project, that I'm doing right now is that like when it talks about data management and data ownership, my collaborators, right, the clinic site, the clinic organization itself are the owners of the data. And actually, I mean, this is, it's just the name of the game, and make sure that, that you're actually comfortable, because you may have to make some agreements that I did, where it's like, if they tell me I can't use the data anymore, well, too bad for me, right? It's their data. Even though I did all the work and whatever, it doesn't matter. I mean, that's what I'm saying. Ownership can be something that you really need to think about. I think one thing that I always do, just a little side note, I also believe that ownership of the data is the person that provided it themselves. So this is why, like, I tell my participants, in almost any study that I do, that, please use your ID number, because at any point in time, if you change your mind about me using your data, me using your interview, for anything, let me know, that way I can track it down and I can destroy it, right? But that's just because that level of ownership is the agreement that I make with my participants, right? It's their words, and it's really a privilege for me to use, their stories, right? So ownership, it can be a little bit complicated. I think, yeah, the texts do talk a little bit about ownership, but just some real, those are just kind of like the key points, and there are other ways of approaching things like data ownership, but that's just because, of the tradition that and the social scientists that trained me, right? So, but ownership can, just as a finishing note, remember, it could be the funding agency itself, it could be property of the U.S. government, it could be, it could actually be, in some of the data that I've worked with, had to be partly, UTMB had to be placed on an ownership list, right? Like a memorandum of understanding had to include UTMB as an owner, so, of the data itself. So, so just think about it. It's not just this thing of like, well, it's my data, or it's the organization's data. It can be a little bit complex. So just be cognizant of that.